August 6, 1945, 6 in the evening. At Farm Hall, a Georgian manor house in the English countryside, Werner Heisenberg sat in the drawing room reading a physics journal when Captain Brodie, the British officer in charge, walked in carrying a BBC transcript. The room was comfortable. Overstuffed chairs, Persian rugs, afternoon light streaming through tall windows. Nothing like a prison, though that's what it was. 10 German scientists, the cream of Hitler's atomic research program, had been detained here since July. Comfortable detention, but detention nonetheless. Heisenberg looked up from his journal. Brodie's face was carefully neutral, but something in his posture suggested the paper he carried mattered. The captain handed over the transcript without a word, then left. Heisenberg read it once, then again. His hands began to shake. Not much, barely noticeable, but enough that the paper rustled slightly. In the next room, Otto Hahn was mixing drinks for dinner. In the garden, Carl Friedrich von Weizsäcker walked among the roses. Upstairs, the younger scientists argued about quantum mechanics. None of them knew yet what these men said in the next 12 hours. Everything they said, every conversation, every whispered argument would be recorded by hidden microphones the British had installed throughout the house. The transcripts would remain classified for decades, and what those recordings revealed would change how the world understood the German atomic program, scientific responsibility, and the thin line between genius and catastrophic failure. To understand why Heisenberg's hands shook as he read that transcript, you have to understand what these 10 men believed about atomic weapons in August 1945. They believed building an atomic bomb was theoretically possible, but practically impossible. They believed it would require industrial resources beyond what any wartime nation could spare. They believed it would take years, perhaps decades. They believed the Americans, despite their resources, couldn't have done it this quickly. Most importantly, they believed that they, the German scientists, had been ahead of everyone else, that their understanding of nuclear physics was superior, that if anyone could have built an atomic bomb during the war, it would have been them, and they hadn't built one. Therefore, they reasoned, no one could have. This belief wasn't just professional pride. It was the foundation of their self-conception during 6 weeks of detention at Farm Hall. They were important scientists, temporarily inconvenienced, held for debriefing about work that had been theoretically interesting, but practically irrelevant to the war's outcome. Soon they'd be released, return to their universities, resume their research. The British had other reasons for holding them. They wanted to know how close Germany had come to an atomic bomb. They wanted to prevent these scientists from being recruited by the Soviets, and they wanted to hear what these men would say when they learned the Americans had succeeded where Germany had failed. So they'd turned Farm Hall into an elaborate listening post. Microphones in the drawing room, the dining room, the bedrooms, the garden paths. 2 intelligence officers in the attic recording everything, transcribing every conversation in German and English. The scientists knew they were being watched. Guards patrolled the grounds. Their movements were restricted. They couldn't communicate with the outside world. But they didn't know about the microphones. They thought their private conversations were private. When Heisenberg read that BBC transcript, a brief announcement that an atomic bomb had been dropped on Hiroshima, that the city had been destroyed, that the weapon had released power equivalent to 20,000 tons of TNT. His first reaction wasn't about the thousands of Japanese civilians who had just died. His first reaction was disbelief. This was impossible. The Americans couldn't have done this. The announcement must be exaggerated, a propaganda claim, perhaps describing a very large conventional bombing raid. He stood up, walked to the door, called for Otto Hahn. Otto Hahn entered the drawing room still holding his cocktail shaker. At 66, he was the oldest of the detained scientists, a Nobel Prize winner whose discovery of nuclear fission in 1938 had opened the door to everything that followed. He'd spent the war directing the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute, coordinating German nuclear research, trying to ignore the moral implications of what his discovery had made possible. Heisenberg handed him the transcript without a word. Hahn read it. His face went pale. The cocktail shaker slipped from his hand, hit the carpet without breaking. For several seconds, he stood absolutely still. Then he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "If this is true, I can't go on living." Heisenberg stared at him. "Otto, don't you understand?" Hahn's voice rose. "They've used fission to kill people. My discovery, my work. I've killed hundreds of thousands of people. You don't know. If the announcement is true, if they've really built an atomic bomb, then it's based on my discovery. My name will be connected to this forever." His hands trembled. "I should kill myself." Heisenberg moved toward him. "Otto, sit down. We don't know if it's true. We don't know if it's even possible." But even as he said it, Heisenberg was calculating in his head. Uranium enrichment rates, critical mass requirements, the industrial capacity needed. Could the Americans have done it? The physics said yes, theoretically. But the engineering seemed impossible. The other scientists, hearing raised voices, began gathering in the drawing room. Karl Friedrich von Weizsäcker came in from the garden, soil still on his hands from tending roses. Karl Wirtz appeared from the library. Kurt Diebner, Walter Gerlach, the others, within minutes, all 10 men stood in that room, passing around the BBC transcript, reading and rereading those few sentences. Their reactions didn't align. They fragmented into multiple contradictory responses that would shift and evolve over the coming hours. Hahn remained near collapse, obsessed with his personal responsibility. If his discovery had enabled this weapon, what did that make him? A scientist or a mass murderer? Heisenberg moved toward skepticism. The announcement had to be exaggerated. Perhaps the Americans had demonstrated a small nuclear reaction, then made propaganda claims about a weapon. The physics was too difficult. They couldn't have solved the problems. Von Weizsäcker, quieter than the others, felt something that might have been envy. If the Americans had actually succeeded, that meant German physics had failed. It meant they, the supposed masters of theoretical physics, had been surpassed. Gerlach, who'd led Germany's uranium project in its final year, felt anger. If this was true, Germany had wasted resources and effort on a project they'd never had the capacity to complete. His work for the past year had been futile. The younger scientists, Erich Bager, Horst Korsching, oscillated between disbelief and a strange excitement. This was revolutionary physics made real. Horrifying, yes, but also extraordinary. By 7 p.m., the drawing room had become a cacophony of competing theories. Calculations shouted across the room, arguments about whether such a weapon could even theoretically function, and underneath it all, the grinding awareness that if the announcement was true, something had changed forever. In the attic above them, 2 British intelligence officers wrote as fast as they could, capturing every word. Dinner that evening was surreal. The scientists ate roast chicken and potatoes while arguing about physics in English and German, mixing languages as their emotions intensified. Heisenberg filled a blackboard with equations, trying to prove the bomb couldn't have worked. His chalk scratched frantically across the surface. Calculations of critical mass, estimates of enrichment percentages, arguments about neutron multiplication. "See," he insisted to the others, "the numbers don't work. The Americans would need tons of enriched uranium. Impossible to produce in wartime." But then someone pointed out, what if they'd used plutonium instead? Different calculations entirely, different production methods. Heisenberg erased his equations and started again. His confidence began to crack. Von Weizsäcker sat apart from the others, smoking cigarette after cigarette, saying little. Later, in his bedroom, he'd confessed to another scientist what he was really thinking. If the Americans have done this, it means we failed. Not morally, We can tell ourselves we didn't want to build such a weapon. But intellectually, we failed to solve problems the Americans solved. This distinction mattered enormously to these men. They could live with moral failure. They'd made compromises throughout the war, accepting Nazi funding, working for a criminal regime, rationalizing their choices as necessary for survival or as patriotic duty. But intellectual failure, that struck at their identity as scientists. Hahn remained the most distraught. By 8 p.m., the others had begun talking him down from his despair, but his guilt remained raw. "It's my fault," he kept repeating. "I discovered fission. I bear responsibility." Heisenberg tried a different approach. "Otto, listen to me. If they've actually built this weapon, and I'm not convinced they have, then we Germans should be grateful. Think about it. What if Hitler had gotten atomic weapons? What would he have done with them?" The room fell silent. It was the first time any of them had explicitly connected their failure to build an atomic bomb with the moral catastrophe that success would have meant. For 4 years, they'd worked on nuclear research for Nazi Germany. Now, suddenly faced with the reality of what such a weapon could do, they confronted what their success would have enabled. "We should be grateful we didn't succeed," Heisenberg said again, more forcefully. "We can tell ourselves we didn't want to put such a weapon in Hitler's hands." Von Weizsäcker looked up sharply. "Is that what we'll tell ourselves? That we failed on purpose, out of moral concern?" "Not on purpose," Heisenberg said carefully. "But we can acknowledge that we didn't push as hard as we might have. We emphasized the difficulties. We protected our research from being militarized. We can take comfort in that." "Comfort?" Gerlach's voice was bitter. "You want to take comfort in the fact that we failed while others succeeded?" The argument escalated. Some insisted they deliberately sabotaged the program, a claim that would recur for decades afterward, but that the recordings would reveal as post hoc rationalization. Others admitted they'd simply believed the bomb was impractical and hadn't pursued it aggressively. Still others argued they'd done their best with limited resources and that Germany's failure was industrial, not scientific. But underneath all these arguments ran a deeper current, the desperate need to rewrite their wartime work as something other than what it had been. To find moral meaning in what had been, at best, muddled choices made under pressure in a collapsing dictatorship. By 9 p.m., they'd constructed a narrative they could almost believe. They were brilliant scientists who had understood atomic weapons were possible but had chosen not to build them for Hitler. Their failure was actually a moral victory. Only Hahn resisted this narrative. "We didn't choose," he said quietly. "We failed. And if we'd succeeded, if I'd given Hitler atomic weapons..." He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. As midnight approached, the conversation in the drawing room had fractured into smaller groups. Some scientists continued calculating at the blackboard. Others drank brandy in armchairs, their earlier confidence dissolving into uncertainty. A few had retreated to their bedrooms, unable to process what they'd learned. Heisenberg and von Weizsäcker sat together near the fireplace, speaking in low voices that the hidden microphones barely caught. "Do you believe it now?" von Weizsäcker asked. Heisenberg nodded slowly. "The BBC doesn't lie about something this significant. The Americans must have done it." "Then we miscalculated. Fundamentally miscalculated." "The physics or the engineering?" "Both. And the politics." Von Weizsäcker leaned forward. "Werner, we told ourselves building a bomb was too difficult, too expensive, too resource-intensive for wartime. We were right, for Germany. But the Americans had resources we couldn't imagine, industrial capacity we couldn't match, and they took the project seriously from the beginning. While we..." Heisenberg trailed off. "While we protected our research institutes, kept our students out of the military, focused on reactor physics because it was intellectually interesting and less morally compromising than weapon design." Von Weizsäcker lit another cigarette. "We made choices, Werner. We can pretend those choices were moral, but mostly they were convenient. Heisenberg stiffened. That's not fair. We did what we could under impossible circumstances. Did we? Or did we do enough to keep our institutes funded and our positions secure, but not enough to actually succeed? Von Weizsäcker's voice was quiet, but cutting. I'm not saying we should have built Hitler a bomb. God knows what he would have done with it. I'm saying we should be honest about why we didn't. Not because we were moral heroes, because we didn't believe it was possible, and we didn't want to waste our careers on a project we thought would fail. And now the Americans have proven it was possible. Exactly. They sat in silence, smoking, while around them the other scientists gradually fell quiet. The initial shock was wearing off. In its place came something harder to articulate, a realization that their understanding of physics, of their own capabilities, of the war itself, had been fundamentally wrong. Upstairs, in the bedroom he shared with Max von Lauer, Otto Hahn sat on his bed, head in his hands. Von Lauer, the only one of the detained scientists who'd openly opposed the Nazi regime, tried to offer comfort. Otto, you discovered a property of uranium nuclei. What others did with that discovery is not your responsibility. Isn't it? Hahn looked up, his face haggard. When I published Fission in 1939, I knew what it could mean. I knew the military implications, and I published anyway. You published because that's what scientists do. We share discoveries. Knowledge itself is neutral. Is it? Hahn's voice cracked. Can we really claim neutrality when we know our work will be used for weapons? When we accept military funding, work in military institutes, take orders from governments that are actively planning mass murder? Von Lauer had no answer. The question had been implicit throughout the war, carefully avoided, buried under layers of rationalization. Now, with Hiroshima destroyed, the question could no longer be avoided. I should have destroyed my research, Hahn said quietly. In 1939, when I realized what fission meant, I should have burned my notes and refused to publish. Then someone else would have discovered it. Fermi, perhaps. Or the Americans. At least it wouldn't have been me. Von Lauer sat beside him on the bed. Otto, if you'd destroyed your research, you'd have been arrested, probably executed. Your family would have suffered, your students would have been conscripted, and fission would still have been discovered, probably within months. I know, Hahn said. That's what makes it impossible. There was no right choice, only different ways of being complicit. By morning, the emotional storm had passed. The scientists ate breakfast quietly, avoiding the topic that had consumed them through the night. But the hidden microphones captured something that the transcripts would later reveal, a subtle shift in how these men talked about their wartime work. Before Hiroshima, they'd spoken of the German uranium project as promising research that circumstances had prevented from fruition. After Hiroshima, they began describing it as a project they'd deliberately limited, moral qualms they'd heroically maintained, resistance they'd bravely performed under the noses of Nazi overseers. The transformation was gradual, almost unconscious. They weren't deliberately lying, not exactly. They were reconstructing memory, reinterpreting ambiguous moments, finding moral meaning in choices that had been made for muddled, complex reasons. Heisenberg, in particular, would spend the rest of his life elaborating this narrative. He would claim he'd deliberately overestimated the critical mass needed for a bomb, steering the German project away from weapons toward reactor research. The farm hall transcripts would cast doubt on this claim. His calculations that first evening showed genuine confusion about critical mass, not deliberate sabotage. But the narrative would persist. The truth, as the recordings revealed, was more complicated and more human than either heroism or villainy. These were brilliant men who'd made compromises to survive under a dictatorship, who'd believed certain things were impossible and therefore hadn't tried very hard to achieve them. who'd protected their research and their students while avoiding too much thought about what their work might enable, who'd been horrified when confronted with the actual consequences of nuclear weapons, then scrambled to rewrite their own history in more flattering terms. 3 days after the Hiroshima announcement, Gerlach broke down completely. He locked himself in his bedroom and wept, not from guilt, but from shame at German failure. "We've lost everything," he told von Weizsäcker. "The war, the country, and now this. They'll think we're incompetent." Von Weizsäcker's response was caught clearly on the recordings. "Walter, would you rather we'd given Hitler atomic bombs?" "No, but..." Gerlach struggled to articulate what he felt. "We should have been the ones to do it. We're Germans. We're supposed to be the best." It was a revealing moment. For some of these scientists, the horror of Hiroshima was secondary to the humiliation of being surpassed. German physics had dominated the field for decades. Relativity, quantum mechanics, nuclear physics itself were all German achievements. That Americans had built the first atomic bomb felt like civilizational defeat. Others reacted differently. The younger scientists wanted details. How had the Americans done it? What design had they used? What enrichment method? Their curiosity overwhelmed their horror, their desire to understand the physics trumping moral concerns. Hahn remained the most consistently distressed. As more details about Hiroshima emerged over the following days, casualty estimates climbing into the tens of thousands, descriptions of radiation effects, photographs of the devastated city, his anguish deepened. The others had begun rationalizing, reconstructing, protecting their self-image. Hahn couldn't or wouldn't. "I discovered fission," he repeated. "Everything that followed came from that." Von Lauer tried again to comfort him. "Otto, you can't control what others do with scientific discoveries. You can only be responsible for your own choices." And my choice was to publish, to share the discovery with the world, knowing it could be used this way. If you hadn't published, you wouldn't have been a scientist. You'd have been a secret keeper. Knowledge that can't be shared isn't science. It's just private information. Hahn looked at him with hollow eyes. "Maybe that's what we should be then, not scientists, just careful keepers of dangerous knowledge." It was a question that would echo through the following decades as physicists wrestled with their role in creating weapons of mass destruction. The farm hall scientists were the first to confront it directly, and their responses, denial, rationalization, guilt, reconstruction of memory, would become templates for how scientists processed their complicity in military applications of their work. In 1967, more than 2 decades after that August evening at Farm Hall, Carl Friedrich von Weizsäcker was interviewed about the German atomic program. He was 55 now, a respected philosopher and physicist, his wartime work a distant memory. The interviewer asked about the moment they learned of Hiroshima. Von Weizsäcker was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "We were shocked, of course, by the weapon itself, by what it meant for Japan, for warfare, for civilization, but I think we were most shocked by our own reactions." "What do you mean?" "We'd spent years working on nuclear physics under the Nazis. We'd made compromises, accepted military funding, told ourselves we were just doing science. Then suddenly we were confronted with what our science could actually do." He paused, and our first reaction, at least for some of us, wasn't horror at the destruction. It was shock that we'd failed where the Americans succeeded. Professional jealousy disguised as scientific interest. You felt jealous? Some of us did. Not all, and not consistently. But yes, there was envy mixed with the horror, which tells you something about scientists, about human nature, about how easily we convince ourselves that our work is neutral, even when it's being done for military purposes. The interviewer pressed, "Did you and your colleagues deliberately sabotage the German atomic program?" Von Weizsäcker smiled slightly. "That's the story we told ourselves afterward. that we were moral heroes who secretly resisted by underperforming. It's a comfortable narrative. But the recordings from Farm Hall, the ones the British finally declassified, tell a different story. Which is that we didn't think building a bomb was practical with the resources available. That we focused on reactor research because it was scientifically interesting and less directly military. That we protected our institutes and students from being drafted or reassigned. That we made dozens of small choices for complex, mixed motives, some noble, some self-interested, most just trying to survive impossible circumstances. He looked out the window at the German countryside, rebuilt now after the devastation of war. When we heard about Hiroshima, we had to reinterpret everything we'd done. We had to construct a story that let us live with ourselves. Some of us chose guilt. Otto Hahn carried that burden for the rest of his life. Some chose denial, insisting the Americans must have used different physics, that we couldn't have succeeded anyway. And some chose moral revisionism, claiming we'd deliberately failed out of conscience. What do you choose? Honesty, I hope. We were scientists working for a criminal regime. We made compromises to continue our work and protect our people. We didn't build an atomic bomb because we didn't think we could, not because we chose not to. And when the Americans proved us wrong, we scrambled to rewrite our failure as moral victory. He turned back to the interviewer. The truth is simpler and more uncomfortable than heroism or villainy. We were smart men who made muddled choices under pressure, who convinced ourselves our science was separate from its applications, who failed at a project we're grateful we failed at, but not because we tried to fail. The interviewer asked one more question. Do you regret your wartime work? Von Weizsäcker thought carefully. I regret that nuclear fission was ever discovered. I regret that physics advanced to the point where such weapons became possible. I regret that we didn't recognize quickly enough where our research was leading. But do I regret my specific choices? I honestly don't know. I made the best choices I could with the information I had, under circumstances I hope no scientist ever faces again. And Hiroshima? Hiroshima should haunt every physicist who contributed to nuclear research. Not just the Americans who built the bomb, but all of us who made it possible. Otto Hahn was right to feel responsible, even if he was wrong to feel guilty. We discovered the science. What followed was inevitable. In the archives at Farm Hall, now a private residence again, nothing marks what happened there in August 1945. The microphones are gone. The transcripts sit in government files, released decades after the events they recorded. But what those recordings captured, 10 brilliant men confronting the consequences of their science, reconstructing their motives, wrestling with responsibility, remains one of the most extraordinary documents of how scientists process their role in creating weapons that can destroy cities. They didn't know they were being recorded. They thought their words were private, their arguments just among colleagues, their reconstructions of memory unobserved. That's what makes the transcripts so valuable and so damning. They captured smart men being human, rationalizing, denying, grieving, envying, and ultimately constructing narratives they could live with. Otto Hahn's anguish, Werner Heisenberg's calculations and rationalizations, Walter Gerlach's shame at failure, Carl Friedrich von Weizsäcker's philosophical acceptance of complexity. All of it recorded, transcribed, filed away, waiting for history to judge. What they said the moment they heard about Hiroshima wasn't just shock or horror. It was something more complicated. Professional jealousy mixed with moral crisis, relief at their own failure mixed with shame at being surpassed, genuine distress at destruction mixed with defensive reconstruction of their wartime choices. They were brilliant scientists confronted with the consequences of their brilliance. And their first instinct was to rewrite history to make themselves feel better about it. That, more than any calculation or equation, may be the most human reaction of all.